At the opening of this international event, we wish to acknowledge Indigenous peoples, the traditional owners and custodians of all lands, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We also wish to acknowledge the Marawina and Palawa peoples, the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which this event is being hosted, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, I'm Dr. Kate Booth. I'm an activist academic at the University of Tasmania and a senior lecturer in human geography in the School of Geography, Planning and Spatial Sciences. I'm also the moderator for this forum today. Indigenous peoples have experienced and are experiencing various forms of collapse rooted in colonisation and industrialised extraction. Collapse of all shapes and sizes has happened before, it's happening now, and it will take down the whole planet if infinite growth on a finite planet, if the imperatives of colonialisation, extraction, and Western consumption are left unchecked. This is hard to hear, it's hard to process, and it's hard to live with. So please take care of yourself and each other during this forum and after this forum. Please seek support from loved ones and trained professionals as need be. These are difficult times and we shouldn't be alone in this. The focus of this forum is to detail some dimensions of these difficult times, those related to the idea of overshoot. Overshoot is the fact that to sustain our lives, we are using almost 2 planets instead of the one that actually exists. More specifically, and this is really important, many Western peoples and places are using up to 5 planets to sustain lifestyles rather than to simply live. This idea of overshoot encompasses, it takes in a trifecta of crises we now face: biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. We will be hearing a lot about overshoot in this forum. First from Megan Seibert. Megan is director of the Real Green New Deal in the United States. She is a systems thinker committed to steering humanity away from its failing trajectory. She conceived the Real Green New Deal project in response to the short-sighted rhetoric about energy and sustainability, feeling a need for sober analysis to inform action commensurate with the severity of our predicament. Then we will hear from Tristan Sykes. Tristan is a co-founder of Just Collapse, an activist platform dedicated to justice in the face of inevitable and irreversible global collapse. He's a long-time social justice, environment and truth activist, having founded Extinction Rebellion and Occupy in Tasmania. He is also currently coordinator of Free Assange Australia. This forum will conclude with a discussion and Q&A, and here we'll be joined by Professor Bill Rees. Bill is a human ecologist, ecological economist, former director and professor emeritus of the University of British Columbia's School of Planning in Canada. Best known as originator and co-developer of ecological footprint analysis, Bill has authored hundreds of peer-reviewed and popular articles on unsustainability. He is an award-winning scholar and internationally recognised Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. I'm also happy to let you know that we have approximately 330 attendees in this forum today from all around the world. If there are people here who have stayed up late because of the time difference between Europe, the United Kingdom and other places, then I hope you have a warm cup of something to sustain you. I would also like to acknowledge that this forum is in English, which is not everyone's first language. We hope that translation can occur on the video after the fact. Also, at the risk of leaving some out, I would like to acknowledge that attendees today come from a diversity of backgrounds and interests. This includes those with an interest in deep adaptation, degrowth, eco-socialism, the zeitgeist movement, and the deep, deep greens. So before we hear from Megan, I'd like to locate our conversation today in some history, drawing on a wonderful Tasmanian scholar and poet, Pete Hay. Pete is one of the people that has shaped environmental political thought at the University of Tasmania and within our discipline of geography and environmental studies. He is one of my key influences and thus one of the reasons why it is the University of Tasmania that is hosting this internationally significant event on collapse. So drawing in part on Pete Hay's book, published in 2002, called Main Currents in Western Environmental Thought. People have been ringing the alarm bells about issues of overshoot, of humans, some more than others, sucking the lifeblood out of the planet for the last 50 years. This initial alarm from early Western environmentalists came from, to quote Pete Hay, a deep felt consternation at the scale of the destruction wrought in the name of a transcendent human progression upon the increasingly embattled life forms with which we share the planet. It is an instinctual and deep felt horror at the maelstrom of killing and insensitivity to forms of life that characterises our times. Since the rise of the Western environmental movement, battles in the name of the environment, natural values and associated human rights have been fought around the world in the global north and the global south. There are too many issues, places, groups and individuals to mention here, but I suspect that there are many in our audience who hold a lot of knowledge and experience in this regard. Many people in many places have fought long and hard. Not everyone got it right all of the time in these struggles. So much of environmental thought, as Pete Hay points out, is Western, and as such runs the risk of carrying with it colonialistic and imperialistic tendencies. Some of the early debates on the role of human population, for example, were, by today's standards, premised on racist and imperialistic assumptions. One proponent of population control in the face of environmental damage in the 1970s, for example, argued that the United States should use its imperial might and leverage control over those poorer nations with high population growth rates. This position is blatantly racist, blatantly imperialist, and conveniently failed to accurately identify the causes of environmental destruction, including colonialisation, industrial extraction, and overconsumption by the affluent West. So environmental thought and politics has learnt some lessons along the way, but still I think contains some tensions, some of which we may hear today. But through a slow but determined process of decolonisation, the environment and climate movement is moving forward. The voices of Indigenous peoples, of feminists, of others who identify and critique embedded and inherited structural violence are important to acknowledge in this regard. Today, what concerns many is not only an instinctual and deep-seated horror in the maelstrom of violence perpetuated on other life forms, as Pete Hay describes, with reference to early Western environmentalists. Today, it is also an instinctual and a scientific knowing and a deep-seated horror at the maelstrom of violence that is being unleashed on ourselves. It is also an instinctual and scientific knowing and a deep-seated horror at the maelstrom of violence that is being unleashed on ourselves, first and foremost, of the maelstrom of violence that is being unleashed on those already disadvantaged, dispossessed, and marginalised. It is within this context that in this forum, we will hear a contemporary turn in discussions on population. Population is controversial, we acknowledge that. But in this forum, we are unapologetic in opening up conversations considering equitable, humane, and decolonised approaches to global population, amongst other things. Our presenters will explain why, and I won't steal their thunder here. After Megan and Tristan have spoken, the Q&A is your opportunity to pose questions, to challenge the presenters and engage in discussion. Now, because we have such a large number of people in the audience, I will do my best as moderator to pick a range of representative questions, and I apologise in advance to anyone I missed. So I'll now hand you over to Megan Seibert from the Real Green New Deal project. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan Seibert and I'm really happy to be here today alongside Kate and Tristan to discuss a alternative conception of climate change in the lead up to COP26. I'm the executive director of the Real Green New Deal project. That is a US-based nonprofit think tank. I founded it in January of 2020. And the purpose is to burst the fantasy bubble about renewable energy and sustainability. It's our assertion that we're being sold a very dangerous myth about climate change and how to respond. And we weren't seeing any other organizations around the world that were telling the entire full truth about our interconnected ecological crises. So we set out to tell that entire truth. We are pursuing two main objectives to try to burst that fantasy bubble. The first is to simply change the message, change our collective paradigm about climate change. So we are trying to change the story about our unsustainability crisis from one of technological-based false hopes to one of clear-eyed ecological realism. And based on that, building on that, we are also setting out to develop a concrete, actionable plan for the energy transformation. Put another way, we're developing a genuine energy transition plan. I'm sure you've all seen the numerous energy transition plans that are out there that have been produced by academic institutions and researchers that in our estimation are quite fantastical and not grounded in biophysical reality. So to accomplish both of those objectives, you could essentially say that we're setting out to change the diagnosis about climate change and to change the corresponding cure. So the typical conception of our ecological crises is that climate change is the singular existential crisis that humanity is facing. And then if we can simply switch to clean and green energy technologies, and if we can stop emitting carbon, voila, our problem will be solved and we'll be living sustainably. This is far from the truth. The reality is that climate change is only one symptom of the underlying problem, which is ecological overshoot. So that's the first point. The second point in transforming our conception of the diagnosis is that the response to climate change, which is typically touted, is that we need a massive build out of so-called renewable energy technologies. We're pushing back and saying, in fact, what's being touted as renewable energy is indeed not renewable or sustainable. And we're also pushing back against this myth of decoupling and net zero, which we'll go into later. So that's kind of our conception of the three main areas where we need to change our understanding of what we're up against. And to change the cure and response, we're saying that we need a dramatic contraction of the human enterprise. This is the only possible response to overshoot. And what that would entail, very simply, is massive reductions in the global human population. We need to get real about what actually constitutes renewable energy and what doesn't, and what that will mean for our way of life. And based on those two things, we need to develop as I spoke about earlier, a genuine energy transition plan, a genuine concrete blueprint for how we can radically transform society. And a key part of all of this is that, as you may have surmised by some of what I've been saying, life after fossil fuels will essentially look like life before fossil fuels, which of course took many forms. It's not like there's one blueprint or one template to go off of, but nonetheless, we are returning to some form of life before fossil fuels, and we think it's absolutely crucial that we highlight the fact that this has many gems, there are many silver linings to this, and that this is something that is not to be feared. So we're going to take each one of these in turn. So let's start with changing the diagnosis. That first point, that the problem is overshoot, not climate change. As I mentioned, the fundamental crisis that we face is ecological overshoot, and the climate crisis is just one symptom of overshoot. What is overshoot? Many of you are probably familiar with it. We could put it very simply that overshoot is too many people on the planet consuming and polluting too much beyond the carrying capacity of the ecosphere. Put a little bit differently, overshoot happens when we are exceeding the biogenerative and assimilative capacity of the ecosphere. The signs of overshoot are everywhere. If your eyes are open and you are at all aware of what is going on, these are self-evident. Globally, we're consuming and generating the amount of waste that requires the equivalent of 1.75 Earth's worth to produce and process. This is the result of the work of the Global Footprint Network. The human population is almost 8 times larger now than it was at the beginning of the fossil fuel age. It's been growing at a rate nearly 20 times faster. This exponential growth simply cannot be sustained. It can't be sustained for any species anywhere. Many of you are probably well aware of some of these statistics that prior to the dawn of the industrial age, humans accounted for only 1% of total mammalian biomass, and 99% was accounted for by other non-human wild animals. Today it's the reverse. 96% of all mammalian biomass on Earth is accounted for by humans and our domestic livestock, and only 4% is wild species. McRae et al. Estimated that between 1970 and 2012, non-human species declined at enormous rates, 81% for freshwater species, 36% for marine species, and 37% declines in terrestrial species. We could go on and on. The signs are everywhere. The evidence is everywhere. We simply have too much of a human impact on the planet. We are suffocating the planet. Climate change is only one symptom of overshoot. Climate change is a pollution problem that exists alongside many other pollution and overexploitation problems. So we have biodiversity loss, deforestation, ocean acidification. All of these are parallel symptoms of overshoot, and we cannot focus on one of them while ignoring the meta problem of overshoot. The second main point that our organization is making is that what's being touted as renewable energy technologies are indeed not renewable. We go into this in detail in a journal article that William Rees and I recently co-authored that appeared in Energies. It's called Through the Eye of a Needle, an Eco-Heterodox Perspective on the Renewable Energy Transition. We also go into it in detail in a white paper that we wrote that's on our website called Pulling Back the Curtain on the Energy Transition Tale. But just to highlight a few of our main points here, every technology that is being touted as renewable is entirely reliant upon fossil fuels at every step of their life cycle. Notably in manufacturing, which relies on very high temperature heat that can only be generated by fossil fuels. They rely on a whole array of non-renewable metals and minerals that have been vastly depleted during the industrial age and whose extraction entails significant ecological destruction and social injustices. These technologies use an array of toxic inputs and produce an array of toxic byproducts. This is hardly sustainable. These technologies have short, finite lifespans ranging from 20 to 30 years for solar panels and high-tech wind turbines. We're talking more like perhaps 75 years for large-scale hydropower and nuclear power plants. And the result of this is that we're generating tons of waste that simply cannot be waved away with the magic wand of the circular economy. This is another myth that we're being sold. And not only does this generate a lot of waste, but it requires continuous replacement of all of these technologies in perpetuity. By definition, this is not renewable. This is not sustainable. And finally, even though EROI is a very complex area of research, and the numbers are all over the place, if you look at the studies that have truly taken a full life cycle analysis approach, and that have used very wide boundaries, we see that solar and high-tech wind have a very low EROI, which is in fact too low to power modern society. Moving on to the final points of decoupling and net zero. Decoupling is a buzzword that we see all over the place with regards to sustainability and renewable energy. Very simply put, this forgets or denies that humans are embedded within nature, and that decoupling it from nature isn't even theoretically possible. All humans, all species, all organisms on this planet have some sort of an impact on their environment. They extract resources from their environment and they produce some sort of waste. It is not possible to decouple any organism from their environment. And yet we are grasping so hard for so many different straws to try to perpetuate this unsustainable way of life that there are plenty of academics and credentialed researchers who have actually bought in to this notion that common sense tells us is a complete impossibility. Net zero says that where we, quote, cannot reduce carbon emissions, we can remove CO2 from the source or the atmosphere through either engineered or natural means. And of course, there are a lot of different problems with this. First of all, carbon removal relies on unproven technologies that can only be manufactured using fossil fuel-based techno-industrial processes. And as we discussed with some of the renewable energy technologies earlier, if we were to build them out at the scale that would be required, we would turn the planet into an uninhabitable rock because we would extract so many non-renewable materials and destroy ecosystems to such a large extent. This relies on the injection of toxic substances into the ground. It ignores the point that we have to embark on ecosystem restoration, not just to sequester carbon, but to heal our planet and its life support systems. And the notion of net zero seems to forget that we need to completely cease using fossil fuels. Net zero seems to think that we can continue using fossil fuels so long as we sequester their emissions. And this is another myth that we're being sold. We have to completely stop using fossil fuels because they'll eventually be depleted or unavailable because they'll be too financially and energetically costly to extract. And not only that, but extracting, transporting, and processing fossil fuels entails ecological impacts of its own, regardless of the carbon emissions. In summary, if we take a 30,000 foot vantage point and tie in everything that we've just been talking about, it's our assertion that modern techno-industrial civilization is made possible only by a one-off inheritance of energy-rich fossil fuels, for which there are simply no quantitative or qualitative replacements. What most people perceive today as normal is actually the single most anomalous blip in human history that cannot be repeated, that cannot be sustained. And even if there was some sort of an equivalent replacement for fossil fuels, which there isn't, we have to come to terms with the fact that it is precisely abundant, cheap energy that's led us into this state of severe overshoot. The bottom line is that we need to power down. And we really like a question that was posed by the authors of the recently published book, Bright Green Lies. And they asked, are we concerned with sustaining modern techno-industrial civilization or with sustaining Gaia and all of her inhabitants? And we have to point out that if our goal is to sustain life as we know it today, we're going to destroy the planet in the process. If we're actually concerned with saving the planet, then we have to come to terms with the fact that life after fossil fuels, will look like life before fossil fuels, that life as we know it today simply will no longer be possible. So moving on to an accurate diagnosis in response, or an actual cure rather, in response to the actual diagnosis, the accurate diagnosis. The response to overshoot, which is our fundamental problem that we're up against, is a contraction of the human enterprise. And very simply put, this means that we need far fewer people consuming far less energy and material resources, giving far more room to nature and all of her other creatures. This requires moving on three main fronts, which we outlined in detail in the journal article I mentioned in Energies. The first front is a global one-child fertility standard to reduce the global population to the 1 billion or so people that can live sustainably and in material comfort on a planet that we've already damaged significantly. We have to get real about what actually constitutes renewable energy and what doesn't. And we need a plan to radically transform society, both infrastructure and how it works, how it functions, within a set carbon budget and a set time frame. So taking global population reduction first, again, if we use the template, life after fossil fuels will look like life before fossil fuels. At the onset of the industrial age, the global population was about 1 billion. So this is roughly the size that we'll have to return to. We just want to address some of the common critiques of population reduction. First of all, it has to be pointed out that cultures all throughout human history have recognized the need to control population sizes, and they've done so in a variety of ways. The fact that we push back against the notion today that overpopulation is even a phenomena, is even real and legitimate, is an indication of just how disconnected we are from nature, from natural processes. And it's absolutely crucial that we come back into that healthy state of connection. As we mentioned before, humans are an embedded part of the ecosphere. There is no way to separate us. There's no way that any species can grow exponentially forever. I'm sure you're all aware of some of the standard hostile terms that are thrown around to anybody who talks about the need to reduce populations, and these are, racism, ecofascism, and the like. And at least with regard to our proposal, which is a global one-child fertility standard, it has to be pointed out that a standard that is applied universally is by definition not discriminatory in any way. So all of these claims just become ludicrous on their face. The notion of coercion comes up frequently in discussions about population reduction, and I think it's important to talk about this from a broader vantage point, that we have to understand that all laws and rules and regulations in society, whether we're talking about a tribal society or modern global society, are inherently coercive in nature. And if the word coercion seems a little bit strong for some people, then we can say incentivizing, but regardless of which word we choose to use, we're being coerced or incentivized by societal rules and regulations to act in a way in which individuals do not harm others, and in a way that contributes to the betterment and sustainability of the collective. So the fact that we routinely hear about, quote, coercion in the realm of population reduction, but not any other aspect of society, or do we talk about being coerced into driving the speed limit? Do we talk about coerced into paying taxes, etc.? This is an indication of intentional manipulation and fear-mongering. So to us, the question is not one of coercion or not, but what are just ethical ways to bring about any desired societal outcome? And there are plenty of perfectly humane and just tools to reduce human populations. That some inhumane and unjust approaches have been used in the past, specifically and most notably forced sterilizations or forced abortions, by no means negates all of the other perfectly sensible tools in the toolbox, and it does not mean that we should use those inhumane tactics. They should by all means be discarded. The bottom line is that a non-fossil energy regime simply cannot support anywhere close to today's global population of 8 billion people. If we did not have fossil fuels tomorrow, there would be a massive population crash. If we fail to painlessly reduce populations of our own accord, we'll guarantee a traumatic crash imposed by nature. The second front that we need to move on is energy realism. Basically, we have to relinquish our faith in modern high technologies, all of these technologies that are being touted as renewable when they're not. We have to realize these technologies are dependent on fossil fuels and they are destructive of the ecosphere. We have to stop grasping for straws that we think can sustain our modern way of life. We have to come to terms with the fact that truly renewable sources of energy, that we're aware of now, will include essentially biomass, mostly wood, simple wind and water generated mechanical energy, passive solar, and human and animal labor. The final front of a planned contraction is a transformation plan. While there is a lot of discussion about how much of a carbon budget we might actually have left, At any rate, some budget needs to be identified and it has to be allocated over an identified period of time, say 15 to 20 years, to essential uses, decommissioning the most critical fossil fuel-based infrastructure, building renewable infrastructure, supply chains, and transportation networks based on the localization imperative of a reduced energy regime. We need to nationalize fossil fuel companies that aren't already nationalized and establish a plan for phase out. Put an end to interest-bearing debt, which is one of the primary drivers of unsustainable growth. And this might actually have to include some use of negative interest. We need to redistribute financial resources that have been unfairly appropriated by the very few at the top. Establish local self-governance structures that will begin to manage their own people and resources in cooperation with other self-governing bodies. In other words, we need to shift from the centralized nation-state regimes that we know today towards more decentralized regimes in which people manage themselves in cooperation with others. We need planned migrations and resettlements from unsustainable, dense urban centers and vulnerable coastlines. And we need large-scale ecosystem restoration that will serve multiple purposes. Of course, it will sequester carbon, but besides that, it will bolster the ecosystem integrity for benefit of both humans and non-humans alike. Will increase social ecological resilience and increase the stock of biomass available for energy consumption. A final note on planned contraction, and we think, as I mentioned earlier, that this is a very important point to stress, is that we need not be fearful of the future that awaits us. I think a lot of people are scared when they think about losing the opulent luxuries that we have today. And of course, this will be a difficult band-aid to tear off. But in doing so, we also need to really focus on the silver linings that await us. And we want to point out two of those silver linings. The first one is that we'll live more physically active lives in closer connection with each other and nature, which will go such a long ways towards restoring our shattered sense of well-being and connection. You know, so many of us are suffering from isolation and loneliness and lack of truly rich social and cultural lives in this modern world. And going back towards this simpler way of living where we're connected with each other in nature will restore that shattered sense of connection. And the other point is that a waning focus on material progress will allow for emphasis to shift to progress of the mind and spirit. In other words, while we'll move away from material growth, we will grow in non-material areas. And these are largely untapped frontiers at the moment that have virtually unlimited potential. A final note that I'd like to point out is that we think that both top-down and bottom-up pathways need to be pursued in order to build the new world. We want to point out that even though we believe that we should do everything possible to induce governments to take action, we're not naive about the entrenched level of corruption and the inertia within the system and how much time it might actually take for collective paradigms to change. That being said, we still think, at least at this point in time, it's possible to try to create that change from the top, induce governments to understand the actual nature of our crisis and to act accordingly. We also think it's important to act in parallel, focusing on bottom-up options as well. We see, at least at this point in time, kind of two sub-pathways for pursuing bottom-up change. The first is establishing what we might call survival seed communities, composed of like-minded people who are aware of what we're up against, who are establishing fossil-free communities that are as self-sufficient as possible, that can endure in the face of the really catastrophic changes that we face in the future, and that will be made even worse by the likelihood of government inaction. And we see these survival seed communities as being brought about in two different ways. This is a whole separate conversation, but just to talk about it briefly here, they could be brought about either from scratch, so essentially buying land and building an intentional community from the ground up, or by redesigning and retrofitting existing neighborhoods and communities. There are, of course, challenges and roadblocks to both of these pathways, but nonetheless, they're both viable options. The other pathway for kind of essential or primary pathway for bottom-up change is creating new governance structures that can supplant existing structures. So whereas in the first bullet where we're talking about inducing governments to act differently, this pathway is creating, instead of butting up against existing structures and trying to get them to change, this pathway focuses on building new structures that can make the existing structures irrelevant. And for one example of this, you could check out Earth Constitution Institute. That's the end of the presentation. Thanks for listening, and William Rees, who's one of our directors, and I can both take questions and comments at the end during the Q&A session.
Oscar Wilde once said, "If you're going to tell the truth, make it funny or they'll kill you." So anyway, that might get awkward. Hello everybody, here in Murrawinna country, Tasmania, and a big hello to all the people joining us from around the world. My name's Tristan and I'm co-founder with our moderator Kate of Just Collapse, an activist platform dedicated to justice in face of inevitable and irreversible global collapse. I'm here today to let you know that when facing collapse, not only is there something that can be done, there is something you can do. At the outset, I'd like to say that Just Collapse entirely agrees with the Real Green New Deal's assessment of the diagnosis. Just Collapse does not, however, entirely agree with the cure. Whilst Just Collapse recognises population pressures are very real and entirely correlated with overshoot, we also recognise that structural violence and privilege makes a uniform approach to population pressures problematic. Just Collapse advocates for an approach to overshoot that is decolonised and equitable, an approach that redistributes power to the marginalised, disadvantaged and dispossessed, because these are the people who are first feeling the impacts of collapse. They have much to fear, which is why justice must be at the forefront. Okay, collapse. Sounds a bit scary, right? In fact, collapse is not new. The classical mind collapse, the fall of Rome, the collapse of the USSR. These are all examples of previous collapse documented, recorded, and recognised by both history and collapsology research. Collapse is, and always has been, inevitable. Social, economic, ecological collapse has happened before, is happening now, and inevitably more collapse is coming soon. Which brings us to our friend here, Mr. Wile E. Coyote, who is looking back at a world where the ground still met his feet and is desperately hoping that it may still be possible to return. He is soon to find out it is not. Mr. Coyote is processing the dawning reality that he has a problem of significant gravitas. This is the uh-oh moment before the splat. Which brings us to the important issue of problem definition. The logic is simple. If you don't identify the problem, you can't identify the solution. And taking action on a problem you haven't defined is problematic. So, what's the problem? The human enterprise has experienced phenomenal growth over an incredibly short period of time, and now we are facing physical limits and the consequences of having stretched those limits past breaking point. It was some decades ago now that the human enterprise of extraction, consumption, and exploitation reached a state of ecological overshoot, and for 40 plus years now we've been taking more from the planet in any given year than the planet can regenerate in a 12-month period. According to global ecological footprint analysis developed by Professor Bill Rees and colleagues, we are currently sucking down 1.7 planets per year. This abuse of our life support system puts our global overshoot day this year as the 29th of July. Of course, unless you're an economist, it's clear that this situation is entirely unsustainable and comes with consequences, many of which you will already be aware of. So, we've identified the problem. Let's look at the facts. Problem, we're in extreme ecological overshoot, scientifically measured as the global usage of 1.7 planets per year. Fact. This overshoot is driving the 6th mass extinction, the ecosystem collapse, and climate change. Fact. Continuing in overshoot is triggering ecological and climate feedbacks that in turn will ultimately trigger global collapse. Fact. Stopping overshoot requires at the very least and arguably more 0.7 planets worth of reduction in extraction, exploitation and consumption. You can do the math yourself. 1.7 minus 0.7 equals 1. Fact. There is an extremely narrow window to reach a global ecological footprint of less than 1 planet per year. Fact. The enormous scale of the required contraction of the human enterprise and the speed with which it must be attained clearly meets the definition of collapse. And just collapse invites everybody to seek justice and to take action for a just collapse, because the truth is that our collective predicament has reached a point whereby ecological and social justice can only be found through a serious contraction of the human enterprise, a rapid and radical degrowth, a just collapse. It's self-evident that infinite growth on a finite planet has no future. We can either plan for it and soften the impact, or we can plummet off the cliff like Mr. Coyote. Now, as many of you will already know, this is an exponential curve. This is pretty much what the human enterprise of infinite growth on a finite planet looks like. Hundreds of thousands of years of living within natural limits, and then the onset of the industrial era, and the line going just about straight up is where we are now. The great acceleration. Progress. The exploitation of cheap and abundant energy has allowed us to pursue the collective insanity of neoclassical economics. infinite growth, finite planet. In the global north of privileged first world countries, we historically, with our legacy of imperial expansion and colonialization, it is we who are responsible for the lion's share of exploitation, extraction, and consumption. And we must acknowledge this fact if we are to find any measure of justice as we face inevitable collapse. Many people struggle when confronted with the reality of socio-ecological collapse and all its implications. Understandably, struggle to throw off their historic enculturation into paradigms of infinite growth and progress, and considering their own contribution or lack of contribution to equity and justice, feeling impotent, inadequate, inappropriate, or otherwise awkward, quickly move into one of many forms of denial. Performed solo, as you can see here. Here as a group, and as a beach party, and variations thereof. So, unless, as it seems, as Elon Musk does, you believe that human civilization is on the verge of breaking Star Trek, it's easy to see that the trajectory of this exponential curve cannot be maintained on a planet already in extreme ecological overshoot. So, the big question is, what's the other side of that curve going to look like? At the moment, the world is trying to make the other side of the infinite growth curve fit in with a global reduction in carbon emissions. So it's important here to briefly examine the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Now, the IPCC has modelled 5 shared socioeconomic pathways, SSMs for short, with projected outcomes for each model. At the outset, I would like to point out to you that it's not controversial to say that modelling can only ever be as good as its input. Having said that, all of these IPCC models include the assumption of continued infinite growth on a finite planet. None of these SSMs include modelling for degrowth. And all of these models include the deployment of technological fantasies of mitigation which not only remain unproven in terms of efficacy, but also are impossible practically to deliver at the scale required. And they're not idiots. They know. And they add it to the modelling anyway, because without it, the emperor has no clothes. The return of the human enterprise to ecological limits is inevitable. The longer we remain in overshoot, the sharper the descent. So of all these 5 shared socioeconomic pathways, I like the first one, the pale blue model, best. It's called SSP1, but I like to call it the Pollyanna model. Living in a la-la land where there are no significant political impediments, maximum energy return on investment, endless efficiencies discovered, no war, no disagreements, no cheating on your emission pledges, no resource shortages, no supply issues, no problems. Now, with projected outcomes of between 1.5 and 1.9 degrees, this pale blue model should be a very, very dark red. The other 4 models should be black. So, back to that infinite growth curve. What's the other side going to look like? Well, basically, there are 3 scenarios. The first is BAU, business as usual. A continuation of globalized trade with more energy for everyone, neoclassical free market economics, and of course, economic growth. Growth maintained by continued extraction, exploitation, and consumption. All of these IPCC models live here, even the Pollyanna model, which, let's face it, is entirely unrealistic. Gently fiddling with the status quo while the world burns, this business as usual scenario ultimately and inevitably ends in an unplanned, unjust collapse of the human enterprise, taking pretty much everything else with it. Let's call this the road to hell. Now, scenario 2, getting all the buzz. Some call this a just transition, a Green New Deal, a total transformation of our entire world into a renewable energy utopia. What they don't tell you is that all this cool, shiny new stuff has to be made using massive industrial extraction and processes with a carbon budget that we don't actually have. This is crash or crash through thinking. You know you're going to hit the iceberg, so let's just make sure we hit it really hard and see who breaks first. There's nothing just about this transition, nor can it be called green. This is simply infinite growth on steroids. Hypergrowth, the end result of which is an unplanned, unjust collapse of the human enterprise, taking everything else with it, but faster. If business as usual is the road to hell, this is hell in a Humvee or Tesla. Now, the third and only sane option in an otherwise insane world is a rapid contraction of the human enterprise, a radical degrowth, a just collapse to a state prior to ecological overshoot. This is not going back to the past, this is going back to the future, if indeed we are to have one. A planned collapse is a just collapse. Collapse is inevitable. Justice is not. So, what can you do? Get angry. Talk collapse. Just stop contributing to infinite growth. And above all, disrupt, disrupt, disrupt. Visit our website for more details. Thank you.
Impact of renewables, why can't we say that renewables are at least better than the current status quo? For example, isn't the focus on electric vehicles still much better than our current combustion engine vehicle model while still addressing overshoot? Why not also move towards renewables as a better approach for energy? So I have a feeling now that our speakers will reinforce what they've said, but it's a valid question, I think, to start this discussion with. We might hand over to Bill and Megan if you...
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead and start, and Bill can add on whatever he wants. First of all, can you all hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So I don't think it's the correct framing to say our so-called renewables better. I don't know how many people who are watching this right now have read the Energies paper that Bill and I co-authored. But we go into detail about one of the major roadblocks that we don't hear discussed very often with these technologies is that they're impossible to manufacture without fossil fuels. And we go through the litany of reasons why. But the bottom line is that without fossil fuels, we can't even manufacture these technologies to begin with, whether it's solar panels or high-tech wind turbines or the batteries for the electric cars. All of it is impossible outside of our current manufacturing regime. And as I mentioned in the presentation, aside from that fundamental roadblock, we're going to have to mine the planet essentially into oblivion to keep extracting the non-renewable materials that these technologies are built with. So it's not so much an option of, well, aren't renewables a little bit better? It's more of a matter of they're simply not sustainable. They're not clean and green. They're not ecologically sound. And we can't even build them without fossil fuel-based manufacturing to begin with.
Do you want to go ahead, Bill, and add to that?
Perhaps I can add just a couple of points. I think we have to keep in mind that the entire thrust of the renewable energy movement, and indeed of the COP meetings, is to maintain the current growth trajectory. So it's not a question of shifting to something and downsizing. It's a question of shifting to something and growing. So you can go online and find any number of websites who talk about climate change, and never about overshoot, but climate change is a massive economic opportunity because of the trillions of dollars that must be invested in job creation and in the all the things Megan talked about, the exploitation of new mines and so on and so forth, to keep the party rolling. So point one, the whole transition is based on the idea that we can keep growth intact and the current system more or less as is. I call it business as usual by alternative means. The second point is something that's almost always overlooked, and that is that we are utterly dependent on abundant, cheap energy to feed ourselves, for example. Agriculture is wholly fossil fuel based at the present time. So if we have such a tiny and limited carbon budget, should we not be rationing that to absolutely essential needs? Nobody absolutely needs an electric vehicle, which in the long run is not really that much better than an ICE vehicle. We need food. Everybody needs food. We should be dedicating what remaining fossil or carbon budget we have to reorganizing the food processing and agricultural system to keep that kind of vital thing intact. Otherwise, the crash will leave us rather worse off than otherwise.
Yeah, look, I don't see why I would add anything to that, Bill and Megan, because that's absolutely spot on. I entirely agree. Kate might want to say something. Do you want to know? Well, let's grab another question then.
Yes, we'll grab another question. So this is one, you argue this is one for the Real Green New Deal project. This is from Catherine. You argue that a global facility standard applied universally is not by definition discriminatory. And Catherine disagrees with this on the grounds of recognising colonialisation and history for populations around the world. So Megan, I wonder if you'd like to add some clarity around the Green New Deal's project's stance on population.
Well, I think maybe I need more from Catherine on why she thinks that a universal standard applied globally is discriminatory.
Okay, so Catherine,
I mean, the bottom line is our global population is just far in excess of the carrying capacity, and populations everywhere need to be reduced. And yes, we have this whole history of colonialism and exploitation, but the bottom line is the predicament we're up against now is that we need to get down to about roughly 1 billion people, and populations everywhere are, like I said, in excess of the carrying capacity. So Catherine might want to expand on her position.
Well, I suppose, look, I gently pushed back on this earlier when I was delivering my PowerPoint. So maybe I can speak a little to this, which is just, you know, not all oranges are oranges in this case. So you've got applying a universal standard sort of assumes that everybody comes to it from a particular base. So it doesn't recognise you know, the privilege of opportunity that we have in the West to be able to choose to have one or no children, as many people currently are. Whereas in other cultures, I mean, sometimes there isn't even the empowerment of the women and girls to be able to even make choices about their own fertility. So it's just a universal standard sort of can't be applied until you've empowered those women and girls to be able to, and educated them to be able to make those decisions. Otherwise, you're coming in with a
yeah, and
you go, Megan.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Tristan, are you done?
Yes, that's fine. Yep.
Okay, I'm sorry. I absolutely agree with what you just said, and I think that is part of implementing standard. Obviously, you can't get there overnight. There would have to be a long process of getting to the point where women are in a position to have only one child. So absolutely, to everything you just said, that would be part of the end goal.
Okay, I think that clarifies it, Megan.
I think, this is an extremely important point. So a universal standard is not something that would be imposed by any legal jurisdiction necessarily. We just assume that it's recognized that economic independence of women, security of family is an important backgrounder to being able to make the choice to have just one child. And there are many other ways that we can go about making this fair, but we have to have a global conversation about it and actually put it on the table for negotiation. Right now, it's taboo. Even at the COP conferences, population will not be mentioned as an issue whatsoever. And yet we can show easily with eco-footprint analysis that population growth right now, plus rising incomes of middle and lower class or lower income countries, is the principal driver of the current growth of the human enterprise, of the human eco-footprint at any rate.
Great answers there to a provocative question. So we'll take a question from the room in Hobart in Sandy Bay now. Does anyone have a question? There's a hand waving up the back. I'll walk over with the microphone so that audio is maintained. So you can take, when you're asking a question, legal advice is you're allowed to take your mask off. So.
My name is Bruce. It's not a profound question, just a simple one that you haven't. I kind of agree with what or can see what people are saying. I've not taken a lot of time to get to the stage, towards the stage you are, but underlying the change, the collapse, whatever you call it, there has to be an economic transition, or I think collapse is more likely. So could people shed light on what model might be possible to continue, would lead to an economic model that might work in the future? Thank you.
Megan, do you want to start? Did you want me to take a shot at it?
Yes, so I'll just jump in with a few things. So I think some of the things we highlighted, it's really important to end interest-bearing debt, possibly even go to negative interest. And to me, the conversation about economics can be a little bit abstract sometimes. And I think if we just ground it in concrete terms, if we do away with interest-bearing debt, if we're reducing the population, if we're setting a cap on the use of remaining fossil fuels, and we're starting to consume less energy and less materials, I think all of those things in tandem will achieve that goal of reducing stopping economic growth and reducing economic throughput. So yeah, I find it helpful to just ground it in practical terms instead of talking about the economy in an abstract sense. But to the extent we are talking specifically about economics, I think it's absolutely crucial that we do away with interest-bearing debt.
Okay, let me jump in just for a second here. What we're dealing with is something that is tantamount to a wartime situation. This is an emergency. It's a long, slow emergency. No government is prepared to grasp this nettle at this point. But we really need to come together with some honest politicians to understand that in order to make this transition, almost everything we take for granted in the structure of our economy today has to change. If you think about the wartime situation, people had to accept rationing. They had to accept redistribution of income. They had to accept a whole variety of things that we don't even talk about right now. But if we're really going to have a transition that is just, it means a redistribution of wealth and income. It means creating social programs, such as we have done through the pandemic, to ensure that people have at least a reasonable income, that they can access the necessities of life as the economy readjusts to these new circumstances. So basically, we're talking about a revolutionary change in the structure of national economies within an overriding global framework to assure that the whole human family can downsize in a reasonably just and smooth fashion. Otherwise, we're going to see, as we're already seeing, increasing competition, increasing militarization, increasing battles over the remaining resources, and a general breakdown of global order. And if that occurs, all bets are off in terms of us being able to make a smooth, just transition to a better way of living by the end of this century. So it's nothing short, as I say, of revolution here.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I totally agree with both what Bill and Megan have said there. I would just add this, that like in terms of the process to actually get to making that kind of economic transition requires an informed populace. You've got to have an informed citizenry that actually understands what the problem is, because if you don't understand the problem, you can't take any action on the problem because you don't know what the solution is. So you've got to talk collapse. You've got to talk to people. You've got to have these conversations. You've got to make people understand what the problem is so that we can have an informed citizenry that can direct this contraction, because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. Infinite growth is going on infinitely until it goes the other way. That's all I would add to that.
I think it's a very important addition, Tristan, but we have to keep in mind that virtually the entire political and economic elite of the world today is in direct opposition to everything we're talking about here. Literally billions of dollars are spent every year reinforcing the existing paradigm. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to inform people about the nature of a reality because we're in this era of post-truth, where people live in their little internet bubbles, reinforcing completely false visions of reality. And so while I agree with you utterly, we've got a much bigger problem than we would have had even 50 years ago in getting people adequately informed about this problem. In fact, there's hundreds of different agencies actively working to misinform people and deliberately sidetrack the discussion away from the issues we're talking about.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here that cut across a number of people, including Kate from Gadigal country and Christian. And this is about what level of energy use we might see in a post-fossil fuel world. For example, will we still be using computers and mobile phones and running modern medical technologies? And how can we convince people to give up their industrial civilization comforts and have what is termed here a reduction in lifestyle? So we'll start with Megan or Bill.
I'll give the first stab. So no, we're not going to have computers and cars and all of these fancy high-tech gadgets that we've become accustomed to. Again, life before fossil fuels, life after fossil fuels. If we consider what truly renewable energy is, you know, we talked about biomass, just wood essentially, simple mechanical generation, passive solar. We're not going to have all of these high-tech conveniences with that sort of energy source. So no, life as we know it today is essentially going away. But as I pointed out, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think a lot of people would agree that's not a bad thing. And what was the second part? How can we convince people to give up? I think this is part of the problem, is that sure, we should do everything we can right now to reduce our energy and our material consumption. But if we were hypothetically to embark on an intelligent, planned contraction of the human enterprise, and we are slowly doing away with fossil fuels, we are doing the sort of rationing that Bill talked about a moment ago, this will all, the level of consumption will kind of automatically be taken care of. So of course, within the current system, sure, do everything we can now to reduce consumption, but a rationing process under a just contraction would do that for us.
I'd like to point out something that perhaps we tend to forget even in this kind of discussion. We're really talking about this phenomenon of overshoot. Someone has already mentioned that we are using today the equivalent of 1.7 planet Earths. Even school children have asked me, well, how can that be possible? We've only got one planet Earth. And it's possible because over geological time, nature has built up vast storehouses of various resources. Fossil energy is an example, but so are our soils, the forests, fish stocks, and so on and so forth. So we are currently using these resources to grow the human enterprise by harvesting not only the annual production, but a significant part of the standing stock. And that is by definition a fatal situation. You can continue to expend your resources right up until the last moment you run out, and then all chaos breaks loose. So this isn't an optional circumstance we're talking about here. We don't have a choice about whether there will be a slowdown or a collapse. I don't care what you call it or not. It will happen because we are literally consuming the biophysical basis of our own existence and polluting what's left. So that we're both consuming and polluting ourselves out of existence. That's what all the statistics you heard about earlier are all about. This is, as I say, a fatal circumstance. So we have no choice. The only choice we really have is whether it will be a chaotic implosion or one that governments recognize as a reality, recognize that there is possibly sufficient public support for taking the kinds of actions that we need to take, and then simply getting on with the global plan implemented at national and subnational levels to make it all happen. So the problem is, we know what we need to do. The how we need to do it is a very much more difficult problem, and that's what we're talking about now. How do you convince people? How do you convince governments to take necessary actions? And that's where all of you have a part to play, because I think Tristan's made the point that a democracy, for example, is only as good as the level of knowledge and information that its citizens can bring to bear on their political leaders to make things happen.
Thanks, Bill. I am aware we are running a little bit over time, so we'll take two more questions. One from the room in Tasmania, and a hand's just gone up, so I'll come around with the mic.
Hello, my name is Bronwyn. Bear with me, mine's a little bit of a long question. I've just been making a few notes. While it's fairly obvious that the using the resources that we have at the moment is going to exceed the availability, it's not a sustainable thought to do that. But I have the question that the practical feasibility of global acceptance of the strategy to achieve these goals I question that the time it's going to take to reduce the population and to actually make changes to the lifestyles will exceed the time available that basically the world has. So how do you respond to how we can address that, in short?
I'll just jump in really quickly and say, you're absolutely right. And this is an issue so many people raise. And I think it's just a really simple response, is that all we can do is all we can do. I mean, yeah, we're about 2 millimeters away from the edge of the cliff. We do not have much time. The scope and the scale of what we need to do is absolutely daunting. But all we can do is show up and do the best we can do and do the most we can do, have these sorts of conversations that aren't even being had. And like Tristan said, it starts with having the conversation. So, whether or not there will be a nice, happy ending and we'll do all of this intelligently, or it's going to happen in a really ugly way, remains to be seen. But all we can do is put our best foot forward and talk to everybody we can, push up against politicians as best we can, just do everything we can, but it might not end well. I don't know.
One thing that humans hate to face is that some problems are insolvable. And we may be up against an insolvable problem. And I think Bronwyn has put some dimensions on it. We have very limited time to achieve a massive transformation of a whole culture that has taken 200 years to get to this particular stage. So it will have a very rough period. There will be lots of unhappiness. But as Megan says, what else can we do? We can either sit back and bear the brunt of the worst possible case, or do all we can to ease the way down as best we can.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question. It's a really, really, really important question. I totally agree with what Megan and Bill have said in this regard. I suppose, obviously there's a planned or an unplanned. You've either got a plan or you don't, and but the contraction is inevitable. So it's the degree of the contraction is what's up for. That's where the fight is. That's how sharp is that descent going to be, and how unjust and how nasty. So that's the fight we've got ahead of us. And so regardless of how, not all collapses are the same collapses. We can have, it's a scale. It's not. It doesn't have a single value. It's an N factor. I think that's about it, really. Thanks.
Okay, one last question. So this is an amalgamation of questions and issues that have been raised from Zoom participants, and it's to do with the relationship between democracy and authoritarianism and bringing about rapid change. So I haven't framed that as a question, but what is the role of democracy and what are the risks of authoritarianism in a contraction of the human enterprise?
Megan?
Yeah, sure, I'll start. Well, I think we all understand. I mean, I'm in the US. I'm sorry, were you done with your question? I'm seeing lips moving. Maybe the video is lagging. Were you done?
You can speak.
Can you hear me, Kate?
Yes.
Okay.
Megan,
Can I keep
go ahead.
going? Okay. I mean, how many people live in a democracy right now anyways? I know we certainly don't here in the US. I think, we do the best we can to the extent we're trying to fight for top-down systemic change that's just and humane. We do the best we can to push governments in their existing form to understand the actual nature of the problem and to respond accordingly. if we're talking about a planned contraction that would inherently involve rationing and limiting freedoms in certain ways, I don't think that that necessarily has to entail authoritarianism. I think that can certainly be brought about by democracies to the extent democracies exist. But yeah, I certainly don't think we want to move towards authoritarianism, and I by no means think that's necessary.
Oddly, one of the ways of avoiding authoritarianism is for people to become truly democratic and take to the streets. Right now, I mean, Megan's made the point that the US isn't a democracy, but that's pretty much the case around the world. In most of our so-called liberal democracies, the corporate sector has seized the reins of government to a very large extent. And that's why at these major international meetings, including the COP meetings, the corporate sector is represented, but none of us are. So we have a very difficult situation that we have to take control of. And if you look historically, rapid social change takes place when millions of people voice their concerns by taking to the streets. I'm not advocating revolution here, but I'm certainly trying to emphasize that until sufficiently large numbers of people exercise their right as citizens to march in the streets, to demand the kinds of changes that are in the popular interest, I don't think much is going to change at all. We're really in a situation now where the corporate sector and vested interests are really tuning the whole of the global economy to maintain their positions of strength. And it's time that ordinary people who are taking the brunt of the damage and who will suffer more in the future take charge of the situation by exercising their right in all countries to march in the streets, to voice their opposition to what governments are doing.
Yeah, hear, Bill. Thank you. That's exactly right. But of course, we can't make that happen unless we have an informed citizenry. And again, this is why we need to get this message out. It needs to get out, and then we need to take action, and we need to make it clear that we're just not going to take it lying down. So, thanks, Bill. That's perfect. Cheers.
Okay, please join me in thanking our presenters today and all the attendees, including the questions that have been raised. The Real Green New Deal. The Real Green New Deal project, which is Megan and Bill, has an online presence, a website, and they're on Twitter. Just Collapsed has a website, Facebook, and Twitter presence if you want to keep engaging beyond this conversation. And as I said in the start of this, we are facing head on very difficult challenges, very difficult times. If you felt confronted or unsettled by what you've heard today, please don't be alone in that. Reach out to people for support. Collapse is inevitable, it's confronting, so please take care of yourselves following this forum. And yes, we look forward to engaging with you online if Facebook and Twitter and the web is your cup of tea. So thanks to everybody again for this session.
Thank you. And look, we're going to continue the conversation. If people want to join us over on Facebook, if people want to send questions there, we'll happily check that out. So yeah, do get online, do contact us, do keep the conversation going. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.